We saw a lot of millennials turn out in 2018. Still not enough. And we've seen this increase in political interest from younger people. One, why do you think that is? And two, what needs to be done to make sure everybody's out exercising their civic engagement?
Well, I think 2016 and the election of Donald Trump really shocked a lot of us into a new level of engagement. And I think that helps explain why we saw a lot of people coming out to the polls in 2018. But also a lot of young voters are skeptical. They want to know, is this really going to matter? Is this really going to speak to my concerns? And does my vote count? The only way to change something you don't like, though, is to get out there, fire the people in charge if they're not doing a good job, and make that happen. And the most empowering thing we have is our opportunity to go to the polls and change the leadership of this nation. It's what makes America America. But we've also got to make sure we're communicating with people in different ways. You know, there's something to be said for clipboards and phone calls, but there's also something to be said for using digital media and interpersonal relationships to organize, to get people out, to motivate people to volunteer and eventually to vote. And I think it's a very important part of how we finally get this new generation, the millennial generation, the largest ever in America, to be as much a factor as other generations that will vote either way. And so the question is, do you want your voice to be heard too?
So I think in our lifetimes, this is the first time that race has played such a huge issue in the campaign. We saw it in 2016. We're seeing it now. You have been one of the candidates out front to call Donald Trump a racist, call a thing, call it by its name. You've also made a lot of effort to reach black voters. Tell us, because one of the reasons I'm asking is because I think it's important that it doesn't have to be a person of color to call out racism. You've done that. Tell us why you felt it was important for you to do that.
Well, I think we got to stop treating this issue as something that only candidates of color talk about, or something that candidates only talk about to audiences of color, because this entire country is made worse by the effects of systemic racism. Of course, they are worst for those who are discriminated against, but all of us are worse off with the conditions that we're living in. Who wants to live in a country where some people are not getting the same access to justice in the criminal justice system, where black Americans are less likely to have their descriptions of pain taken seriously at an emergency room, or their job applications called back when they send in a resume? This is no way to organize a country that believes itself to be the best on earth. And of course, systemic racism has a deep history that is as old as the country itself. Frankly, the biggest thing that needs to be overcome, I think, is among white audiences. And it's one of the reasons why I talk about systemic racism when my audience is majority white. I think there are a lot of people who have been too comfortable, and frankly, a lot of them are Democrats who believed that we had overcome a lot of the worst of racism. And while this may come as no surprise to a lot of people of color, I think it was really the way that it arrived at the surface after Trump got elected that helped awaken a lot of white people to just how serious of a problem this is. I'm not wealthy, but I am white, I am male, and that means it's so important that somebody like me be speaking to racial justice, just as it's important that I speak about a right to choose and about making sure we have gender equity in this country, precisely because of those reasons. Lastly, as mayor of a diverse city, about 25% black, one that's had a lot of struggles with race, one where right now we are dealing with the aftermath of a police-involved shooting, and where we're looking at what it's going to take for residents of color to have the kind of trust that we all need, black residents in particular, to have with law enforcement.
So you brought up the shooting that happened, and we saw the footage of like some of the black residents there, yelling and upset, and you were facing that, and it wasn't a personal attack on you, but just frustration with a system. As a white male confronting those things, how do you navigate that space? Because it can feel like people are mad at you when we know it's a system of white supremacy.
Well, it's part of what I had to learn. Look, to some extent, it's fair game to be mad at me if people feel like I should have made a different policy choice. But this is also about the system we're living in. And often what might look on its face as anger is actually a complex that involves anger and fear, and it's justified fear. We're still waiting on an independent investigation on what happened in the case of Eric Logan, the individual who was shot. But regardless of what that investigation tells us, we know that anybody who has a loved one who looks like he did is reminded of their fears whenever somebody leaves the house. And if we're not speaking to that deeper set of issues that is rooted in racial inequity and systemic racism in this country, if we're not willing to confront that, painful as it is, including meaning that people like me, as a mayor, have to walk into a room sometimes and just absorb a lot of that pain, We have to do that, or else this is never going to get better.
So I want to talk about your marriage a bit because, you know, in communities of color, specifically the Black community, there is a lot of homophobia. There's violence everywhere. But again, we see some of these things exaggerated in the Black community, recognizing that it's different in certain communities of color, that it's not the same everywhere. How would you address that inequality?
Well, I think a lot of this is generational. One of the things I've found is that there's a younger generation of people of color who are completely accepting, but an older generation that's struggling, especially in the Black community, but not only in the Black community. I think what we need to do is lay out the necessity of treating each other as human beings and appealing to the sense of compassion that is in the hearts, even of people who are living with some kind of prejudice, and overcome that. One of the things I've found from the first months when Chasten, my now husband, and I were dating, in a pretty socially conservative community in Indiana where we live, is that we would just go out there and expect to be treated like any other couple. And that's what happened. Not everybody, but most people, when they see other people as human, all the other stuff falls away. And whenever we're trying to get across one of these divides, that's our best chance of doing it.
So Lil Nas X recently came out as being gay. Did you happen to talk to him or reach out to him?
No, I've never met him, but you know, I like Old Town Road just like I know. Hey, it's a great song. Don't get me wrong. I love it just like everybody else.
Congrats! You know, thanks, welcome. Glad you came out. Well, took a lot of courage.
If you're watching, I'd love to congratulate you in person. But no, it did take a lot of courage, and I was impressed when I saw that. I tweeted about it, and you know, I think every time a performer, an athlete, a politician has the courage to come out, it sets an example for others. Because I think there's still, you know, it's twice as hard. For especially a young Black person who's realizing that they're different in another way, LGBTQ, to know that they're not alone. And you're not. People just need to know it.
There are a lot of voters out there who think that they can vote for this president and be okay with his racism without themselves being called racist.
Right.
And that seems to be the line of voters that a lot of candidates are going after, which again, as a person of color, I hear that and it gives me pause.
Right.
So specifically, because I know you're saying, well, no, not the hardcore Trump voters, but I'm talking about the people with the economic problems who, you know, still think, yeah, I might cast a ballot for Donald Trump. I know he said all these racist things, but he still might get my vote. What do you say to those people? We
just have to stand up and say that the racism is wrong and ask people to stop and think about what this presidency represents. I don't believe the world's divided into completely good and completely bad people, because I've never met somebody who's perfect or who's 100% evil. I do believe that presidents and candidates bring out sometimes the best or the worst in us. And there's no question that this president has brought out the worst in a lot of people, including the racism, including the prejudice. And, you know, to somebody like me and probably to most of us, you know, when it comes to something like racism, everything else is multiplied by zero if that's what you're seeing. But there are some people who have brought themselves to be able to look past it, believing that somehow that's not what is in their hearts. We have got to reject this completely. And it's a tough road to go down for a lot of people who don't want to believe that there's anything racist about them. And yet there's something racist about your vote, at least what you were on board with. And we've got to move beyond that, but we can do it together.
Okay, before I let you go, you've been a mayor. Tell people why it's so important for them to exercise their civic engagement.
Your vote is your voice. And we live in a system that will not change, will not get better unless you use that voice, use that power. Volunteer, vote, get in the faces of your elected officials and ask them what they're doing. Show up at council meetings, show up at demonstrations, show up at the ballot box. Because, you know, in this country, when somebody's not serving you well, you get to change them out. That's the whole idea of democracy. And we've got to make our democracy better by making it easier to vote and by dealing with districts that are unfair. But even that doesn't happen if you don't vote out the people who are keeping the system the way it is. Mayor Pete, this has been an excellent conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. And that does it for us at Be Woke Vote. Thank you so much for tuning in. Pay attention to Mayor Pete.